Mr. Deputy Speaker, I was calculating that this is the 18th budget to which I've responded in some capacity, and the 4th directly to the Shadow Chancellor, but I think since he wrote many of the other 18, probably responding to him indirectly. But there are some traits that I've picked up having heard him over the years. I mean, one, he obviously has this capacity for the crunchy, memorable soundbite, which then often turns out to be wrong. I think he was the author. I think he was the author of the phrase "no more boom and bust," the consequences of which we're still living with. I think he was the author of triple dip recession, is that not right? Which of course we never had. I think when we first had these exchanges a couple of years ago, he had a very good football chant going with the backbenches behind him, which was, I think, growth down, inflation up, unemployment up. And now, of course, we've got growth up, unemployment down, and inflation down. And I think his favourite, certainly the current one, is the millionaire's tax cut, which I would find a little bit more persuasive had I not sat there for 10 years being lectured by him and his boss that any increase in the top rate of tax above 40% would be counterproductive and damaging to the economy. So, but I think the one feature of his speeches I think we all look forward to is the annual conjuring trick. The 10 different ways you can use a banker's bonus tax. And the rabbit out of the hat trick gets progressively more difficult because the rabbit gets bigger and the hat gets smaller as we go through time. And I just sort of remind him of some of the figures. When he was the Cities Minister and was presiding over all this, the total banker's bonus pool was something of the order of 11.3 billion. It was 11.5 billion the following year when the Labour government brought in a banker's bonus tax. According to the Centre for Economic and Business Research, which monitors these things, the current banker's bonus pool last year was 1.6 billion, and the current year is estimated to be 1.3 billion. It is 1/10 of the size of the bonus pool on which the original tax was placed. So you're then left with the question, and this is at the core of his fiscal policy, how are you going to get 3 billion of tax out of a 1.5 bonus pool? I think that the charitable way to describe this is as a mathematical puzzle. It's something we ought to be referring to the new Turing Institute to investigate. But perhaps I just declare by declaring at least one self-interest. I don't have an interest in the millionaire's tax, but actually compared with both him and the Chancellor, I'm more likely to be taking advantage of the relaxation in the annuity rules. And I think it is worth recalling the episodes. I recall coming to this House on many Friday mornings with backbenchers from both my own party and the Conservative opposition, trying to achieve this reform over many years, and we were confronted with relentless stonewalling from the Labour government of the day, of which he was part and I think directly participated in, with a very simple message that pensioners were far too stupid and irresponsible to be trusted with their own pension savings. And that is one of the really big, major positive changes which comes out of this budget.
He said nothing.
I will give them, yeah.
I thank the Secretary of State for giving way. I hope he can explain to me and to my constituents who've seen average gross weekly earnings decline by £160 when adjusted to CPI since the general election, how they're going to be able to afford to exploit this new annuities rather than pension saving.
Well, I'm going on to the issue immediately, which he has posed to us about why we're a poorer country. Of course, there are people who have saved and have got annuities, and there are many middle-income occupational pensioners who will take advantage of that. But the central economic question has been raised as to why we are a poorer country and how has that affected our living standards. And of course, this goes back to the financial crisis which occurred when he and his colleagues were in government. And the Chancellor reminded us yesterday of the brutal fact of the matter that the British banking collapse and rescue was the biggest in the world. It was the biggest collapse in our history, going back not just decades but centuries. And it has done enormous harm. It has made the country poorer. The immediate after effects of the collapse were to reduce output in this country by 7.5%, more than in the Great Depression. Not surprisingly, that has affected living standards in a radical way. It has impaired our capacity to recover by the damage inflicted on the banking system. It has required our country and the United States, but particularly here under his government and this, to resort to very unorthodox monetary policy, which have had major impacts on savings, which the Chancellor is now trying to remedy, on asset prices and other factors. And they are surprised and indignant when they tell us that people are poorer than they were before the financial crisis. What are they comparing it with?
The Secretary seems to be avoiding the fact that people are poorer not just since the financial crisis, but since 2010. And that changes in tax credits, in other benefits uprating and so on, more than outweighed for the lowest paid workers any advantage gained from the raising of the tax threshold.
Well, the distributional analysis, which I'm sure she studies, suggests that the biggest impact of this shock has been on the highest 10%. Maybe surprising, but that has been what has happened. But let me just take apart the particular aspects of the argument which has been put forward. How it relates to jobs, to production, and to earnings. But let me start with jobs. I've taken an intervention. Let me just start with employment. What could well have happened as a result of the financial crisis and its aftermath was mass unemployment of the kind that we had in the 1930s. We could very easily have got up to 20% unemployment. We didn't. We now have the lowest unemployment of any major country except Germany, lower than France or Sweden. This is partly a reflection of government policy, but it's mainly a reflection on the common sense and flexibility of British workers who accepted that in this crisis it was most important to be in work. And we're now seeing the success of employment policy in the fact that we've had this enormous growth of employment, 1.25 million net of public sector job losses, a gross increase of 1.75 million, roughly 5 private sector jobs have been created for every one lost in the public sector. And I've taken a transition in a moment. And these are predominantly, in fact, overwhelmingly full-time jobs. The argument from the opposition has been, well, okay, you've got lots of jobs, but they're part-time. Well, last year, 2013, there were 460,000 new jobs, of which 430,000 were full-time. 95% of them full-time jobs. I'll take the intervention.
We know that zero-hour contract jobs, since this government came to power, have trebled the amount. It's over 500,000 now, and an indicator of that is that in 2012-13, some 3.48 million people had an average national insurance liability of £172, and they were earning less than the lowest income tax threshold. That is an indicator of the type of work that people are having to take now, and they're still having to pay nicks on income below the income tax rate.
Well, we're well aware of some of the problems that arise with zero-hours contracts. That's why, as he knows, some months ago I commissioned a full consultation on dealing with the abuses. What has come out of that consultation suggests that actually it's a very complex story. A lot of workers benefit from being on zero-hours contract and want them to continue. Many don't and do encounter abuse, and I'm sure that before the end of this Parliament they'll have an opportunity to vote on measures designed to deal with those abuses.
Grateful to the Secretary of State. Would he confirm what his Chief Secretary colleague had difficulty in doing the other day, that the employment rate is still below pre-recession levels?
My understanding is that the employment rate, if she's talking about the total adult population in work, is now at the highest level ever, higher even in the United States, which is famed for a flexible labour market. But I really am surprised that the opposition feel that there are issues to be pursued. Somebody muttered immigration. Actually, last year, overwhelmingly, the largest number, well over 90% of jobs went to British workers. I don't know whether he'd studied those. those figures.
I thank my right honourable friend, he's been exceedingly generous. Does he not think it's disingenuous, given the inheritance of this government, which was a reduction in GDP of 7%, presided over by the party opposite? Is it not disingenuous to characterise a reduction in changes in personal allowances, which will affect 25 million people and take 3 million people out of tax altogether, as having nothing to do with the cost of living?
Yes, and I'm delighted he's raised it. I was going to dwell on that more later, and it is a very considerable achievement of this coalition that we have delivered and indeed over-delivered on the commitments that I and my colleagues made before the last election. And of course, it helps those people who are relatively low paid by lifting them out of tax, not just because they pay less tax, but because it reduces the tax rate at the margin and provides a significant incentive to work. Now,
I'm grateful. He's been very generous. Would he address the issue of youth unemployment? In my constituency, 825 under-24s are out of work, and almost 200 of them have been out of work for almost a year.
Yes, I will address the issue of youth unemployment, and he's right to raise it. And this is an issue which, of course, has been with us for many years, including under the last government, when economic conditions were much more benign. Youth unemployment is currently around about 20%, but of course that includes many full-time students. But the key point, the key trend here is that youth unemployment is now declining rapidly. It is certainly now less than the level that we inherited. And we have a whole set of policies designed to deal with it in a systematic way. Now, the Shadow Chancellor has put forward the idea of a youth guarantee. Well, the problem with this presents is, how do you guarantee a job except through the public sector? And if you guarantee a public sector job, of course, you take people off the dole, but you create a permanent need for subsidy and support. What we have done, let me just finish the point, what we have done is to create a route by which people who are not going into full-time higher education can develop the preconditions for a proper apprenticeship through a traineeship, the basic academic requirements plus work experience, and then find their way into true apprenticeship training, which has been an enormous success. It's doubled since we came into office. The measures in the budget yesterday will enable another 100,000 young people under 24 to be taken into apprenticeship training, and the quality improvements we have made is driving up both demand and supply at the same time. This is a much better way of dealing with young people who are out of work than creating artificial jobs.
Before he leaves the issue of employment, he must be aware, and let me say that many of us on this side are very pleased to see the improvement in the employment situation the last 6 months or so, indeed the last year or so, has witnessed. But apart from the caveats around short time working and zero contracts, is it not the big issue, though, that the productive capacity of the economy seems to have shrunk, and the productivity per worker has shrunk, and this is casting a very grave shadow around the length of the prospective recovery we might expect? What are the government planning to do about that?
No, his analysis is absolutely spot on. Of course, that is what has happened. We have managed to avoid mass unemployment, but the average productivity level has fallen. And if we're going to grow, and if living standards are going to grow, and that seems to be the focus of the debate, then productivity has to rise. And that raises the question about how we do it. And we're doing it in an environment which is severely constrained. We have to remember, because I think the Shadow Chancellor often forgets this, that one of the massive legacies of the crisis was the structural deficit, which doesn't go away when you have increased growth. It's there, it's structural, it will have to be dealt with. The structural deficit defined in the way that we started the coalition has fallen from about 5.4% of GDP to 2.7%, almost halfway. We have to continue this job. The next government will have to continue this job. But in that context, we have to progress an agenda of raising productivity and growth. I'll take this and then.
I'm very grateful to the Secretary of State for giving way. Will he acknowledge there is a particularly serious problem with long-term unemployment amongst young people and older people? Long-term unemployment went up in the figures yesterday. Doesn't more need to be done to tackle that problem?
Well, it does, but the figures over the last year suggest that long-term unemployment is falling along with unemployment in general.
The Business Secretary, quite rightly, is giving an excellent speech in favour of hard work. I noticed in the papers yesterday, so it can't possibly be right, that the Chief Secretary had boasted that he had personally vetoed any indexing of relief for higher rate taxpayers. Surely, my right honourable friend, who is pro-enterprise, can't believe it's right that a police sergeant is paying higher rate tax.
Well, I thought that I did listen to the business carefully, and I thought there was an acknowledgement of the position of the people at the top rate threshold. It's a modest increase, but there is a recognition of marginal rates of tax beginning to bite on middle earners, and I think that issue is now being addressed.
I'm grateful. He covers a very important point here, that long-term youth unemployment, which was mentioned by the Shadow Chancellor, also includes numbers of students who are in full-time study. Would he join me in congratulating Bournemouth, where the Arts University, the University and Bournemouth Poole College have actually doubled in size, which means that on the numbers, it does look like long-term youth unemployment has indeed increased, and actually this is not the case.
Yes, I think something of the order of a third of the total number who are classified as youth unemployed are in full-time study. And of course, one of the big changes which has happened, and something for which the coalition government should take credit, is that there's been a continued expansion in higher education. Despite all the doomsday predictions opposite about the radical higher education reforms, the number of people going into higher education, particularly from disadvantaged background, has risen.
Thank you very much. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that the issue about productivity is linked directly to skills? And is it not rather ironic that the Shadow Chancellor was in fact Secretary of State for Children, Schools and Family and signally failed to help this nation get the right degree of skills, unlike us with our long-term economic plan?
Yes, indeed, and I think the apprenticeship model, which we're now developing and expanding rapidly, both in quality and quantity, is the remedy to a long-standing neglect. She's quite right to point.
Is it not a fact that the British car industry will produce 1.6 million cars this year, and Jaguar Land Rover alone will export 13.5 billion? Is it not true that the budget, with its help for manufacturing and for exporters, is bound to help this as a good British success story?
Yes, I was going to come on to the manufacturing incentives, but I think it just emphasised the point, which is very well done, that we have some manufacturing industries, which the car industry is one, which are expanding rapidly, very high productivity, rapid export growth. The same is also true of aerospace, and I was delighted this morning to discover that Hitachi, the leading Japanese company, are going to establish their global headquarters of their railway manufacturing business in the UK, based on their existing investments in the northeast of England and expanding and looking to take business opportunities from the rail revolution which is taking place here. And this is all manufacturing, previously declining, now beginning to become resurgent in some key sectors. But that leads me to the... I'll take one more, then I could press it.
Can I thank the Minister for giving way? Is he confident about the sustainability of the recovery, based as it is almost entirely on consumer expenditure at a time when living standards are declining?
Well, that isn't actually true. I mean, all recoveries tend to start with consumer spending, but there is a deep-rooted problem in the UK of lack of investment we're now trying to deal with. But the figures in the OBR, if he wants to study them, will show that business investment, I think, reduced by 7% last year. The CBI projections for this year are higher than that. So business investment is beginning to take serious shape. But I think when we're talking about growth and recovery and productivity, I think it is worth reflecting on some of those 18 budgets that I've listened to and responded to in the past. For over a decade, we had budgets introduced by the opposition. And every year, there was a until we got to 2008, there was a very positive story, and we had 2% growth, and there was enormous triumphalist cheering about the wonders of brilliant government economic policy that had produced this achievement, and comparisons with the past which suggested this was the greatest economic performance, if not since the Victorians, probably the Georgians, the Tudors, and even the Romans. And you actually had to go back to the Greeks to find the word that captured the spirit of those early budgets. It was the word hubris. A simple inability to understand that there were weaknesses building up during that growth. Now, our government is confident that we now have recovery. We're positive about it. We're proud of our contribution to it. But we acknowledge that there are some deep-seated historical weaknesses that now need to be addressed. And the Chancellor did address them in a systematic way in the budget yesterday. And the first and most important and the driver of productivity is, of course, higher levels of investment. And that's why the big step forward in investment allowances, substantially increasing both over time and in scale the incentives to small, medium-sized companies, and particularly in the manufacturing sector, is so welcome.
Extremely grateful to the Business Secretary for giving way, and he's clearly very confident that he could have run the economy better over the 13 years that Labour were in power. I suspect that sense of enthusiasm and confidence probably continues on into this Parliament as well. So perhaps he could outline some of the ways in which the economy would be run differently under the Business Secretary as Chancellor and not the current Chancellor.
I find that many of my ideas have been incorporated in government policy, so I'm very pleased at the progress we're actually making in that respect. But of course, increased investment does depend on business confidence, and there is a danger, because we're approaching election season, that some of the comments that are coming up from opposite, they were commented on recently by Sir George Cox, I think used to be the Institute of Directors, is an advisor to the opposition, that the business-averse policies of the Shadow Chancellor and his leader were doing quite serious damage, not to their own credibility, but to confidence in the country. And I would probably underline that. If you have policies which appear to commit future governments to freezes in energy prices which prevent new energy investment, you are actually undermining investment. I mean, of course, it isn't just the opposition. I mean, there's people who want to take Britain out of the European Union and want to take Scotland out of Britain. They're also undermining investment confidence as well. But political certainty does require at least literate policies from the opposition, and which in the area of price freezes certainly isn't the case.
I thank the Secretary of State for giving way, and I think he'll know that that actually isn't a very accurate representation of what was said. But could I ask him to make a comment, perhaps, on a concern that is for businesses about net lending, particularly to small businesses, and why he thinks that has still been falling under his watch, and what actually he thinks now is going to be done about it.
Yes, there has been a continued decline in net lending to small business. We think it's bottoming out, but it has happened, and it is damaging, and it is a consequence of the near collapse of the banking system, and the fact that the banks are now responding to much tougher regulation, in some cases by being much more conservative in their lending. It isn't true in all cases. Lloyds, Santander are increasing their net lending to small businesses, but many aren't. But what we're doing in government is establishing institutions, which the business bank particularly, which are developing new flows of finance, new types of finance, internet-based lending, asset-based finance, invoice finance that were hitherto deficient, supporting the establishment of new banks, and I believe something in the order of 20 new banks have been licensed over the last year, dealing with the issue of bank competition that should have been dealt with when the last government were in power, and we had the Cruikshank report. It is now happening. So I think what we will begin to see is the net lending trend becoming much more positive. But there's no underestimating the enormous damage that was done to the British economy as a result of the collapse of the banks, over which the last government had responsibility for many years and did absolutely nothing about.
I thank the Secretary of State again The biggest lender to small businesses is Royal Bank of Scotland, which is in a particular difficulty in re-energising itself. What discussions is the Secretary of State having with Royal Bank of Scotland to try and get them to increase the level of net lending to small businesses?
Well, he's quite right. They are particularly remiss in their lending policies compared with other institutions, and that relates to the seriousness of their balance sheet position and their failed attempt to become a big global bank. But I do meet the Chief Executive from time to time. I think he is trying to change the culture of the bank in a positive way and move it in the direction of some of the other banks like Lloyds, which have already achieved that transformation. So the first priority has been to develop business investment, and the Chancellor's initiatives help with that. I think the second, and extremely important, and it's already been hinted at by interventions behind me, is in relation to manufacturing industry. I think it's important to take stock of the context here. We've had a catastrophic decline of manufacturing industry over a long period of time. Now, some of that, of course, is driven by technology, some of it's driven by international trade, over which we have relatively little control. But certainly in the period after 1997, we saw the share of the British economy accounted for by manufacturing shrink from 20% to 10%. That was even faster than in the mid-1980s, when policies were considered to be unfriendly to manufacturing. We lost 1.6 million jobs in that period.
Secretary of State for giving way again. He's been very generous with his time. He'll be aware that in Teesside, at the Redcar Steel plant, that between 1987 and 1992, the workforce went down from 25,000 to 5,000, with several plants on site being closed. The difference is, of course, that the Secretary of State might well take credit for the Chancellor's policy on the carbon price floor, which, of course, this government has brought in and saw the closure of Alcan in Northumberland has put severe pressure on the steel industry in particular. Could he say, if he could bring forward the programme 2 years earlier than waiting another 2 years?
He's anticipated the point I was going to make, that one of the really positive announcements the Chancellor made yesterday was recognising the difficulties of energy-intensive industries. I'm aware that the Alcan smelter did close. I was there. I talked to the management about it. They acknowledged that although energy prices in the UK were one factor in their decision, it was by no means the only one. But clearly, our energy-intensive industries are crucially important. It is not clever for them to close and migrate overseas. You simply get carbon leakage. You don't do anything to improve the environment. So it's very important that they are protected from the increased costs that result from green taxation. And the interventions the Chancellor made yesterday, which are very radical and meet the concerns of the industry, primarily centre on the renewable obligations and the feed-in tariffs, and giving them effective compensation for those costs. And I shall now be pursuing with the European Commission, trying to ensure that we get state aid clearance for those. And the feedback we've had this morning from the engineering employers, from other manufacturers, suggests that they are well satisfied that the government has taken a radical step which meets overwhelmingly their concerns.
I'm very grateful to the Secretary taking away, and he's making powerful points about the importance of supporting manufacturing, which under the last government cost the City of Gloucester 6,000 jobs. We have created 2,500 jobs since this government came in, quadrupled the number of apprenticeships, and seen manufacturing increase in a way that hasn't happened for about 30 years. Would he agree with me that the opposition simply does not understand what it is that manufacturing needs, and the doubling of the capital allowance is a huge step forward?
Yes, of course he's right, and the industrial strategy which we're following across government gives particular priority to the aerospace industry, and I know that his part of the country is one area which has benefited considerably from the development of the aerospace supply chain.
Grateful to the Secretary of State for giving way, and he touched on the issues around the compensation scheme announced yesterday. But could he, for the sake of clarity, inform the House from the scheme, this compensation scheme which was announced in November 2011, which was due to come in April 2013, how much of that has been paid to energy-intensive industries so far?
I do know that the element which relates to the European Youth Scheme has already been paid. The companies have already received the check. The sums are not large because actually the Youth Scheme proved to be pretty ineffective. But nonetheless, the compensation is being paid, and it is now being extended to a wider range of costs. He seems to be indignant, but I think he should talk to his local manufacturers who've expressed full satisfaction with what we're doing.
I thank the Secretary of State for giving way. He talks about energy-intensive industry, and there is a great deal of that remaining in my constituency of Dudley South. Would he agree that we don't want to see these industries going offshore, where environmental legislation is not perhaps as stringently enforced as it is in the UK? We need to keep those industries here in the UK, and that's what the budget achieved for us yesterday.
Order. Before the Secretary of State answers the intervention, there are far too many conversations going on the backbenches. The House is getting restless. If the House does not calm down and let the Secretary of State get on with it, he'll never come to the end of his speech. Secretary of State.
Well, I'm trying very hard, Madam Deputy Speaker, to take as many interventions as people wish to throw at me. But in relation to Dudley and manufacturing, I mean, he's quite right that it isn't very sensible that we lose manufacturing overseas. You get carbon leakage, you lose the production, you lose the jobs, and it's very much in our interest to stop that happening. We are stopping that happening, and there is a lot of evidence, actually, of the reshoring of production, including to the industries in the West Midlands, which he's aware of. So I think the priority that the Chancellor has given to manufacturing, to investment, and to the savings which lie behind investment, and to exports through the expansion of export credit are absolutely appropriate to getting long-term growth and the productivity that entails. There is a lot more to be done. We still have serious constraints in terms of skilled labour. There are still problems in opening up business finance. We have to invest much more in science and innovation, though we are doing that. But I think the themes which ran through the budget yesterday of support for investment, for savings and for export are absolutely right, and they will take this country to the right place. Thank you.
Order. It will be obvious to the House that there are a great many people who wish to speak